Centuries ago, to venture out upon the boundless, churning expanse of the sea was to gamble with life itself. Those who dared to navigate its depths, encased within fragile wooden hulls, driven by canvas sails, understood implicitly the profound risk. The ocean was a capricious master, capable of conjuring a ferocious squall from a clear horizon, or unleashing a sudden violent tempest that could shatter a vessel and its crew in an instant. The very act of sailing was a testament to courage, a daily confrontation with the unknown, where an unexpected accident or the sheer brute force of nature could extinguish lives without warning, far from the solace of land. To truly grasp the magnitude of a story such as this, one must first comprehend a brutal chapter in human history, an age when humanity hunted whales with an insatiable, indiscriminate hunger, pushing these magnificent creatures to the precipice of extinction. It was an era of chaos and profound imbalance, stretching from the twilight of the 18th century through the heart of the 19th, and lingering even into the early decades of the 20th. People braved the perilous oceans not for exploration, but for the merciless pursuit of whales. Today, our perspective has irrevocably shifted. We stand in staunch opposition to whale hunting, advocating fiercely for their protection and conservation. Yet, there was a time when this relentless pursuit was deemed vital, an indispensable part of human enterprise. The whale, particularly for its oil, was a commodity of immense value. Whale oil permeated daily life, a ubiquitous necessity. Before the advent of kerosene, before the discovery and widespread use of petroleum, whale oil illuminated cities, fueling the lamps that cast their flickering glow upon cobblestone streets and urban thoroughfares. It served as a crucial lubricant for the burgeoning machinery of industry. The whale's blubber, a rich source of this precious oil, found its way into countless applications, driving human progress and comfort. It was this relentless demand that tragically drove these enormous, intelligent, and often docile cetaceans to the brink of annihilation. In that unforgiving era, however, whale hunting was simply a deeply embedded, albeit incredibly dangerous, human endeavor. Indeed, its danger was legendary. Between the 18th and 19th centuries, the hunt for whales was a profoundly manual, visceral affair. Unlike the mechanized efficiency and explosive power of the 20th century, with its gunpowder or air-propelled harpoons, this was a contest of raw strength, skill, and nerve. A whale ship would cast off from shore, venturing deep into the vast, uncharted reaches of the ocean, sometimes for years, seeking the great migratory paths and feeding grounds where immense pods of whales gathered. These majestic creatures, mammals like us, were highly social, communicating across vast distances, living complex family lives beneath the waves. The hunters, driven by necessity and profit, would sail to these remote realms, prepared to shatter that natural world. Upon locating a pod of whales, the mothership would halt, its sails luffing, its massive timbers creaking. From its side, small wooden rowing boats known as dories would be lowered. These frail craft, mere splinters on the ocean surface, would then begin a stealthy pursuit of the colossal animals. With incredible precision and brute force, harpoons would be launched by hand, driven deep into the whale's head. The immediate response was always a violent, terrifying surge of raw power. The harpooned whale, in its agony and terror, would bolt, dragging the small boat at breathtaking speeds through the water, a phenomenon known as a Nantucket sleigh ride. This was a dance with death, a ballet of extreme peril. Whales, in their desperate struggle for survival, could lash out with their immense flukes, shattering boats and men with a single devastating blow. They could breach from the water, landing with destructive force, or dive to incredible depths, pulling the attached boat and its crew into the crushing darkness below. The men in those small boats were shockingly exposed, vulnerable to every whim of the ocean and every desperate maneuver of their prey. Forget safety equipment, thermal survival suits, or the modern comforts of GPS and emergency buoys. They went as they were, their courage and their skill their only shields against the indifferent might of the sea. Many of these men were driven by desperation, with little to lose, or by the allure of a lucrative, if deadly, trade. Opportunities ashore were scarce for those hardened by the whaler's life. While the pay could be substantial, it came at an exorbitant cost. Year after year, ships would vanish, swallowed by the vastness, lost to storms or accident. A 300-ton wooden vessel, adrift in a colossal ocean amidst gale-force winds and towering waves, was a fragile toy in the hands of fate. Distances covered only by the whims of the wind-filling sails became interminable. Favorable winds could propel a ship forward with exhilarating speed, but weeks could turn into months if the wind died or turned contrary, stranding the vessel, a silent, painted ship upon a painted ocean. Such harrowing tales were commonplace. When a ship departed a bustling port, there was always a chilling, unspoken possibility that it might never return. Or, if it did, its next voyage might be its last. Few ships endured prolonged periods in the whaling fleet, and even fewer crews returned intact. For a full crew to disembark at home, every man accounted for, was considered a monumental triumph, a true testament to fortune and skill. The dangers were omnipresent. A rogue wave could flip a dory, casting its occupants into the frigid, indifferent water, leaving them adrift and vulnerable. A harpooned whale might drag a boat and its crew into the abyssal depths, a terrifying, suffocating end. Every imaginable calamity was a palpable, ever-present threat. One of the epicenters of this brutal industry, a vibrant hub for whalers and their formidable ships, was Nantucket, a small island off the coast of Massachusetts on the Atlantic seaboard of the nascent United States. From its docks, laden whalers, their holds bursting with barrels of precious whale oil, would return, their bounty destined for the burgeoning cities, fueling a trade of immense profitability. A single, exceptionally large whale could yield as much as 100 barrels of oil, a staggering quantity that offers a stark illustration of the sheer scale of the slaughter, the countless animals that had to be sacrificed to fill a ship's cavernous hold. It was a terrible, terrible business. Mercifully, humanity has evolved. Today, international restrictions, though sometimes flouted, stand as a testament to our improved understanding and compassion for these majestic creatures. But in that earlier era, Nantucket thrived, a hive of activity, its harbor bristling with the masts of whaling ships, its streets teeming with whalers and adventurers, men seeking their fortunes, their livelihoods. Many of these individuals, unlettered and unprivileged, sought employment aboard these ships, exchanging their labor for a meager wage and the promise of sustenance, or the certainty of death. Among these vessels was the whale ship Essex. Not particularly large, it was nevertheless a well-constructed ship, forged from first-rate timber. Yet by 1820 the Essex was an old hand, having sailed the seas for over 2 decades. Built in the waning years of the 18th century, around 1798, and launched in 1799, it had defied the typical lifespan of wooden ships of its era. Without the benefit of modern technology, such longevity was a rarity. The Essex, however, was known as a lucky ship. With each departure it would return, its holds brimming with valuable cargo, a reliable source of prosperity. It was a smaller whaler, carrying only 4 dories for the hunt, compared to the 6 or 8 typically found on larger vessels, plus a single spare stored below deck. Its displacement was modest, around 240 tons, a mere nutshell compared to the colossal container ships of today, which can carry over 500,000 tons. The sight of its towering masts, its full complement of sails unfurled in port, must have been a magnificent spectacle. But that beauty was merely superficial, a veneer over the perilous reality of life at sea. The Essex had indeed enjoyed a long run of good fortune. Its previous voyage, or perhaps the one before, had seen its captain return with exceptional success. Among the crew on that penultimate journey was a man named George Pollard, Jr. So outstanding was his performance, so evident his skill, that he had earned the esteemed promotion to captain of the Essex. The ship itself had undergone extensive overhaul, receiving much-needed repairs and improvements, preparing it for its next grand adventure. Thus, when the plans for a new voyage were laid in 1819, the Essex was in prime condition, a vessel imbued with a legacy of luck. Its captain, however, was remarkably young for such a command. George Pollard, Jr. was barely 29 years old, an unusual age for the weighty responsibilities of a ship's master. His first mate, Owen Chase, was also a relatively young man. The remaining crew typically comprised 19 other souls, bringing the total complement of the Essex to 21. These were deliberately small crews, a necessity born from the sheer duration of these epic voyages. Whalers often spent 2 years, sometimes more, at sea, a grueling test of endurance. A compact crew allowed for more efficient management of precious provisions and space, vital for survival over such extended periods, even with stops at various ports. So, the Essex set sail with 21 men, the young Captain Pollard, his first mate, Owen Chase, and 19 dedicated crew members. An old ship, a young captain, but a formidable, highly respected crew. All preparations made, they departed. The date was August 12, 1819, from the familiar shores of Nantucket, Massachusetts. Their destination, the remote and bountiful waters of the South Pacific, literally the other side of the world. The Essex was to embark on an arduous circumnavigation, passing through the Gulf of Mexico, skirting the sun-drenched coast of Cuba, then southward along the Atlantic seaboard of Central and South America, a relentless journey towards the dreaded Cape Horn. This notorious promontory, a turbulent meeting point of oceans, was one of the most perilous navigational challenges on Earth. Successfully rounding the Horn, they would then turn northwest into the vast expanse of the South Pacific. The estimated duration of this epic voyage was 2.5 years. Those who stepped aboard understood the profound sacrifice. They would not see their families, their parents, their children, for at least that long, perhaps even longer. For if a whaler secured a full cargo before reaching its home port, it might divert to an intermediate port, unload its precious barrels of oil, and immediately set sail again for another hunt, foregoing the return to Nantucket entirely. This was a tremendous undertaking, transforming a 2-year journey into a potential 3 or even 4-year odyssey. Of course, the promise of significant financial reward awaited them upon their return, if they returned at all. The Essex carried an unusual crew for its time. reflecting a unique aspect of the whaling industry. Unlike many other enterprises, whalers were often less constrained by societal prejudices. The Essex's crew was a mixed complement of white men, free men of African descent, and even former slaves. Among its 21 souls, 7 were black men, whether born free or formerly enslaved. These men were often excellent whalers, possessed of immense strength and courage. Aboard the ship, camaraderie was forged in the crucible of shared peril, transcending distinctions of skin color. What mattered most was skill, bravery, and the ability to navigate the treacherous seas. And so, the extraordinary tale of the Essex began. As the Essex set its course southward, problems swiftly emerged. Scarcely had it entered the waters of the Gulf of Mexico when a sudden, violent storm erupted, catching the vessel unawares. The ship was tossed and battered, violently heaving from side to side so severely that it came perilously close to capsizing. Fortunately, Captain Pollard, despite his youth, responded with swift, decisive action. Ballast was shifted, sails were frantically lowered, and order was desperately restored amidst the chaos. Yet the ship emerged severely damaged, listing heavily. One of the precious dories, the small boats essential for the hunt, was badly damaged, and several of the Essex's sails were torn to shreds. Despite the grave damage, the young captain refused to turn back for Nantucket. Such a retreat would mean the loss of invaluable time on an already immensely long voyage. Through the combined efforts and sheer grit of the crew, the ship was righted, its full buoyancy restored. Rapid, makeshift repairs were carried out, and the Essex resumed its southward journey. For a time, fortune seemed to favor them. No further storms plagued them through the Caribbean waters. However, a new and insidious threat emerged. An exasperating, oppressive calm descended upon them in the wake of the tempest. For 5 weeks, the Essex was becalmed, rocking gently, almost imperceptibly, on the glassy, motionless water. This was not merely an inconvenience. For any seasoned sailor, any whaling captain, such an unnatural calm was a dire omen, a chilling premonition of ill fortune to come. Pollard himself recognized it as a sign of impending disaster. A furious storm, followed by an eerie, unnerving stillness. The sequence felt profoundly wrong. Perhaps the most unsettling incident occurred in the midst of this horrible calm. A gigantic albatross, a bird of immense wingspan, landed silently upon one of the ship's masts. More than one hardened sailor shook their head, a grim, silent acknowledgment of a shared, foreboding destiny. Of course, Captain Pollard, ever the pragmatist, sternly dismissed such superstitious fears, urging his crew to focus on their duties. The youngest crew member was a mere 14 years old, the oldest in his mid-40s. All were strong, resilient men. Finally, the strange calm gave way, and the wind returned. The Essex, reborn, again moved swiftly and gracefully, sailing south along the Argentine coast, eventually rounding the treacherous tip of South America. They paused at a port of call to resupply and carry out essential repairs before continuing their epic journey. A second stop was made in what is now Ecuador, where one of the Afro-descendant crew members, overwhelmed by the accumulating omens and the sheer terror of the voyage, chose to desert. He stepped off the ship in a strange land, a foreign colony where he could not even speak the language, abandoning the perilous life of a whaler, hoping to secure passage on the first available ship out. From Ecuador, the Essex pressed on. They managed to capture a few whales, but soon it became chillingly apparent. The traditional whaling grounds were barren. Months had passed at sea. By January 20th, 1820, some 5 months after their departure from Nantucket, having finally rounded Cape Horn, they had only a meager catch to show for their immense efforts. It was clear that these warm Pacific waters had been overhunted. In port, they learned of bountiful whaling grounds, hundreds of miles further offshore, beyond the remote Galapagos Islands. This intelligence, gleaned from other whalers, ignited a desperate hope. They prepared to set sail once more, embarking on a journey of thousands of miles into the desolate open ocean towards the promised whaling grounds. It was a complex undertaking, fraught with extraordinary risks. They would be sailing into the utter wilderness of the sea. Should anything go awry, there would be no nearby port, no safe haven to seek refuge. Yet the lure of the hunt, the promise of a full hold, called them onward. From what is now Ecuador, they sailed towards the Galapagos, pausing there to replenish their dwindling provisions. Hundreds of turtles were captured, a living larder for the long voyage ahead, and their water casks were refilled. Tragically, their stay was cut short by a colossal act of stupidity. One of the crew, in a thoughtless prank, lit a torch and ignited some dry herbs while the others were collecting turtles. The resulting fire raged out of control, consuming the island's unique ecosystem, wiping out entire species of flora and fauna. The conflagration was so immense that the crew was forced to flee, leaving with far fewer provisions than they had hoped for. Back on board, their course was set. The captured turtles, kept alive on the lower deck in a seawater ballast, were a crucial, if diminishing, food reserve. They would be slaughtered only when absolutely necessary. But far more could have been secured had it not been for that senseless act. The Essex resumed its voyage, pushing ever onward until they finally neared the coordinates, the fabled whaling grounds where they expected to find innumerable whales. But by the time they reached this distant point, it was September 1820. Over a year had passed since leaving Nantucket, and their hold was still far from full. Arriving at this remote location, an unsettling quiet hung in the air. Few whales were sighted, and another problem emerged. Each dory typically carried 6 crewmen. This meant that when 3 boats were launched for the hunt, 3 men remained aboard the main ship to maintain position, to watch, to manage whatever tasks arose. But with the earlier desertion, only 2 men would now remain on the Essex, a precarious and dangerous situation. As they waited, a shout pierced the silence. In the distance, someone had spotted a spout, the misty exhalation of a whale. Immediately, one of the dories was lowered, its crew rowing with furious speed towards the sighting. But as they neared the spot where the whale had breached, it suddenly dove, only to resurface directly beneath the small boat. With a single explosive thrash of its tail, the whale shattered the dory. All hands were thrown into the churning water, yet miraculously, all survived. Another dory, swiftly dispatched, rescued the drenched and shaken men, returning them to the Essex. Again it was a dark omen. Things were not going well. Perhaps they hoped in a day or two their luck would turn. A few days later, the distant horizon showed numerous spouts. The Essex began to maneuver into position, the crew buzzing with renewed purpose. They had already deployed the spare dory, meaning 2 of their crucial whaling boats had been lost or damaged. Only 3 remained. These were quickly readied, awaiting the captain's signal to be launched. Then, with powerful strokes, the rowing would begin, leading them towards the slaughter. It was November 20th, 1820. They had been in these remote waters for a considerable time. The whales were sighted, the dories swiftly lowered, rowing with desperate speed. But no sooner had the first harpoon been driven into a whale than the massive creature exploded into a frenzy of thrashing. It tore away, dragging the boat at terrifying speed, damaging it severely, though it did not sink. The men, including First Mate Chase, managed to row their crippled dory back to the relative safety of the Essex. The other two boats, however, had also successfully harpooned whales, and were being dragged across the ocean, a chaotic spectacle that would fray the nerves of any observer. Chase and his men reached the Essex. The damaged dory was hauled aboard, inverted on deck, and frantic repairs began. It was early morning, the wind was calm, the sun shone brightly, a deceptively pleasant day. Suddenly, a young crewman on deck called out to Chase. There was a strange whale in the distance, he reported. Very strange. An enormous white whale. White. A chill ran down Chase's spine. He had heard the chilling legends, whispered tales of a ghost whale, sometimes called Mocha Dick, sighted near Mocha Island. Could it be? As they strained at the ship's railing, they could discern the immense form of the animal. It was colossal, truly gigantic, and it seemed to pause, observing them. Then, with a sudden, astonishing burst of speed, the colossal creature propelled itself forward, its powerful flukes beating with incredible force. It charged directly at the Essex, smashing head-on into the ship's port side. The impact was cataclysmic, a thunderous blow that sent the ship reeling, pitching violently from side to side. Objects crashed and tumbled below deck. The entire crew stood stunned, unable to process what they had witnessed. Nothing like this had ever been seen. That monstrous animal must have been at least 30 meters long, a colossal albino male sperm whale. Momentarily stunned by its own immense blow, the whale paused. But before the crew could recover, before they could attempt to harpoon it from the deck, the creature turned, swimming away with incredible speed. For a fleeting moment, the Essex crew was left in bewildered shock. What was this? But before their astonishment could fully register, the whale had completed its turn and was now charging back faster than before and visibly enraged. This animal sought vengeance. Some experts speculate that the percussive sounds of the ship attracted the whale. Others suggest this particular animal was a known bull whale, a guardian often seen accompanying pods, instinctively identifying the hunters as a threat. What they could not have anticipated was the sheer force, the deliberate targeted aggression with which this leviathan would launch itself. The whale slammed into the Essex's bow below the waterline, creating a gaping hole. The whale's head was momentarily lodged within the splintered timbers, and water immediately began to surge into the ship's hold. Finally, the animal thrashed free, disappearing into the vast distance. The Essex began to sink with terrifying speed. One crewman, in a desperate race against time, rushed to the captain's cabin, retrieving Pollard's essential travel case, containing navigation charts and instruments, bringing them safely to deck. They frantically began to salvage whatever they could from the rapidly submerging holds, as the ship listed further and further. In the distance, the other two dories, having finally cut their harpoon lines, returned immediately. Captain Pollard, witnessing the unfolding disaster, stood aghast. What in God's name had happened? Owen Chase, leaning over the railing, shouted the unbelievable truth. "A whale rammed us!" The damage was catastrophic, beyond any repair. The ship was dying. Yet, by some twist of fate, the weather remained calm, granting them a precious reprieve. For 2 agonizing days, the Essex lingered afloat, allowing the crew to retrieve vital supplies, salvage what provisions they could, and prepare the small dories. These dories, designed for rapid pursuit of whales, were never intended for long ocean voyages. Improvisation was key. Extra planks were hastily added to their sides to protect against the relentless waves, and makeshift sails were fashioned from poles and canvas, hoping the wind would aid their desperate journey. 3 small boats remained. Aboard them, 20 men would now entrust their lives. Provisions and what little fresh water could be salvaged were meticulously distributed among the boats. Every inch of space was precious, for these were not cargo vessels. Finally, the Essex groaned its last, slipping beneath the waves, vanishing into the abyss. Now the chilling question, where to go? Instinct dictated they must seek the nearest coast, some distant shore where they could find safety. These fragile dories could never withstand a storm. But the stark reality was brutal. They were some 2,000 nautical miles from the Chilean coast, adrift in 3 tiny improvised sailboats with desperately meager provisions in the heart of the immense Pacific. What could possibly go wrong? Their journey began. Captain Pollard, using the salvaged charts and instruments, maintained a course. His young mind focused on survival. Chase, in his boat, also possessed a set of navigation tools. The third dory, however, had none, and was instructed to follow the others, a perilous dependency. Their situation was delicate. Dire. The premonitions, the ill omens that had plagued them from the start, now felt terrifyingly real. That crewman who deserted in Ecuador had spoken of dreadful dreams, chilling premonitions. No one had heeded him. Now they were truly adrift. Not entirely rudderless, perhaps, with their instruments and makeshift sails, but in the gravest of predicaments. The first month passed without the sight of land. Day after day, week after week, they navigated the vast, indifferent ocean in their tiny craft. Then, a miracle, an island. Henderson Island, an idyllic, deserted speck within the Pitcairn archipelago, a British territory. It offered fresh water, a small internal spring. But the island was barren, its resources tragically scarce, capable of sustaining little life. And as the tides rose, the freshwater spring would be submerged for days, its life-giving flow lost beneath the salt water. Pollard and Chase, after surveying the desolate landscape, concluded it was not a place where they could survive indefinitely. A grim decision was made. They would return to the boats. 3 of the crew, however, chose a different fate. They decided to remain on the island, a desperate gamble, hoping that eventually some ship following a known route might pass by and rescue them. With a heavy heart, the 3 dories returned to the merciless sea. Was it the worst decision, or simply fate? In the end, it was perhaps one of the most agonizing choices ever made. Out in the vast ocean, the true horrors began. First, the boats became separated. One of them, without navigation tools, vanished without a trace, never to be seen again. Chase's and Pollard's boats continued their harrowing journey, separating and then, by some cruel twist of fate, finding each other again. Days bled into weeks. The meager provisions dwindled, then vanished altogether. The crew, weakened by starvation, dehydration, and constant exposure, began to succumb. The first to die was from sheer exhaustion, weakness, and the relentless ravages of sun and salt. His body, covered in sores, was reverently wrapped in his coat, sewn into a shroud in the ancient maritime tradition, and committed to the deep. When the second man died, the same solemn ritual was performed. But with the death of the third man, the unthinkable occurred. Driven to the absolute extremes of human endurance by starvation, They made the agonizing decision to consume his flesh. They partook first of the internal organs, then some of the muscle tissue, before reluctantly casting the remnants to the sea. In the other boat, a similar horrifying decision was reached. The gnawing hunger, the profound exhaustion had driven them to cannibalism, to consume the bodies of their fallen comrades, yet even this could not sustain them indefinitely. Days continued to stretch into an unbearable eternity. Soon another man died, and he too was consumed. Then the living began to dwindle, and no one else died for a time. In Captain Pollard's boat, lots were drawn. Yes, they drew straws to determine who would sacrifice their life to sustain the others. By a cruel twist of fate, it was a young relative of Pollard himself who drew the short straw. He accepted his grim destiny with a stoic resignation. In a second lottery, a man was chosen to deliver the fatal shot. He was killed and his flesh eaten. Still, it was not enough. The days relentlessly passed, and the specter of starvation loomed. The other boat, too, had consumed its dead. By February 1821, the small boats were still adrift. On the 15th of that month, First Mate Chase's boat was sighted. They had been at sea for 89 days when another sailing vessel, the whaler Indian, discovered the survivors. The scene that unfolded was horrific. There were undeniable human remains still present in the boat. Despite the grim discovery, the survivors were rescued and transferred to another ship. The dory, with its macabre contents, was secured to the stern of the Indian, but in a squall it was lost to the sea. Some survivors were barely clinging to life, their faces horribly burned and disfigured by the sun, living specters of a tragedy. Miraculously, Captain Pollard was also found. Another whaler, the Dauphin, located his boat, but the spectacle that greeted them was even more disturbing. As the Dauphin approached the small dory, whalers began to call out, trying to hail the occupants. As they drew nearer, they realized only 2 men were aboard, frantically gnawing on bones, like dogs fighting over scraps. The crew of the Dauphin were on the verge of turning away in disgust, realizing with horror that the men were fighting over human bones, human remains littered within the boat. Finally, they were rescued. Pollard, a known figure from Nantucket, was identified. He was able to give coordinates for the 3 men who had remained on Henderson Island, who, by some incredible stroke of luck, were found alive and relatively well. What had seemed like a foolish decision turned out to be their salvation. The survivors were eventually taken to Chile, where they slowly recovered, and after a long, arduous journey, finally returned to the United States. It had been an unspeakable odyssey of horror and survival. Of the 21 souls who had boarded the Essex, only 8 returned. Most tragically, of all those who perished, only 2 had not been consumed by their desperate companions. The fate of the lost dory became a subject of persistent discussion. Years later, a dory bearing a striking resemblance to those from the Essex was discovered. Inside, 3 incomplete skeletons were found, suggesting that this boat, too, had been a scene of cannibalism. This would tragically imply that perhaps 11 lives were consumed, though officially the count remains at 7. Curiously, no formal punishment or legal repercussions followed these acts. In the brutal, unforgiving world of 19th-century whaling, cannibalism, born of desperate survival, was not deemed a criminal offense. Indeed, so unstained was his reputation by the events that in 1822 Captain Pollard was again given command of a ship. However, this vessel, too, met with misfortune and sank swiftly. A second command also ended in disaster. Pollard never climbed aboard a ship again. He became known as Jonah, a harbinger of bad luck, and no one would sail with him. Owen Chase, however, continued his maritime career, sailing throughout his life, eventually commanding his own ship. Other survivors also returned to the sea, while some could never face it again. But the story of the Essex, in all its horrifying detail, lived on. It was whispered in taverns, recounted in seamen's logs, and passed down through generations. Herman Melville, profoundly moved by the accounts of the Essex, would famously use its tragic story as a core inspiration for his epic.
If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to give it a like, subscribe to the channel, leave your comment, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any future episodes. Your support helps us keep creating more content like this. See you in the next episode.